But somebody was in the field going, hey! And maybe, just maybe, somebody all the way across the field called back, hey! And then maybe, just maybe, because this is the blues, somebody got sad and said, go ahead and marry, don't you wait on me, because they were building that railroad that took everything across this great country. Go ahead and marry, don't you wait on me. Well, now, might now won't you win? I go free, might now won't you win? I go free, well, now. I think we're ready.
We have a quiz today, a quiz for you all folks, because I was cleaning out a cabinet and looking around at things. So I came across this. It's very heavy. I think it's greenstone. There was no indication of what it might be. So if anybody has a guess or knowledge, it would be really cool. This is what we do kind of pretty much all day long, is try to keep track of the things that we have. I've been working on an inventory, so this one's one of the interesting ones because it's a mystery item. So come and take a look before you leave. Give me some ideas of what that might be. It's cold, it's stone. I think it's greenstone. Anyway, you can all hear me okay? Great. So, good morning. Welcome to the Jones Library today. Our speaker is certainly no stranger, having given lectures in this series in previous years and been a faithful patron of this library. We're glad to welcome him here. Jim Wright is a product of the Lynchburg Public Schools. He received his BA degree in English from the University of Virginia, then took pre-med courses at the College of William and Mary, and graduated from the UVA Medical School in 1976. He spent 5 years training in internal medicine and endocrinology at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. He practiced endocrinology in Austin, Texas, and Lynchburg. But in 1993, he changed his specialty to life insurance medicine. He retired from Genworth Financial last year. Jim and his wife, Marty, have 4 children. Brian, a musicologist, owns and operates Rivermont Records, and received his MBA last week. Adam is a Delta Airlines pilot, recently promoted to captain. Bo is operations manager for the nonprofit group Protect Democracy and is a Lynchburg City Council person. And Hope is a William and Mary graduate and recently completed graduate studies in environmental sustainability at the University of Edinburgh. Today, Jim will give us a glimpse into another bit of Lynchburg's medical past. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'm glad to be here and share what I've discovered about this little bit of Lynchburg history. I did a lot of research. I actually did too much research. I gave this talk to myself last week and it was way too long. So I cut 25% out. You're welcome. And what else was I going to say? Oh, I got interested in this subject because some years ago, so far back I can't actually remember when, I got an email from Ted Delaney with 3 Xeroxed copies of articles from the Lynchburg newspaper back in the 30s about this very subject. And I had never heard about that before, and sat there on my computer for a few years, and then I remembered it, and I started looking things up, and you know how that goes. You go down one rabbit hole after another, and pretty soon you end up at the Jones Memorial giving a talk. I am going to try not to read this, but if I don't stick pretty close to the text, I will digress. I will go down rabbit holes, and I will overshoot my time. So in the mid-1930s, there was an effort mounted here to build a hospital to serve African Americans. And I just want to tell you what I have found out about that ultimately unsuccessful effort. I don't have time to go into the history of medical care for African Americans, but I do want to point out that it has always been inferior to the care received by whites. Even today, it remains in measurable ways inferior. There were poorly executed, half-hearted attempts to care for some of the 3.5 to 4 million slaves after the Civil War by the Freedmen's Bureau. A handful of hospitals for African Americans were built in the 1890s around this country, all in major metropolitan areas. And in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, a number of hospitals in small cities like ours, medium-sized cities, efforts were put forth by African Americans to build hospitals for themselves. In some smaller cities, particularly in the South, hospitals for whites had a segregated ward for black patients. And that was the case in Lynchburg. You know, other than the Civil War hospitals that closed right after the war, Lynchburg did not have a hospital until Martial Lodge 39 opened its home and retreat in 1886. By 1910, though, the population of Lynchburg was about 29,000. And the nearest thing we had to a hospital was the almshouse on Hollands Mill Road. And that, let me see, what did I want to say about that? Oh, so, and according to Dr. Elisha Barksdale, let me show you a picture of him, if I may. The almshouse was, quote, a forsaken rat hole for paupers and Negroes who had no medical care, end quote. And it was Dr. Barksdale who actually first proposed the construction of a city hospital. Construction began in 1911, and this hospital opened the following year. Patients were still segregated by race, and that really remained the case until 1966. Even before the Lynchburg Hospital opened, though, there were private black hospitals in the state. Dr. Sarah and Miles Jones, a husband and wife team, opened a hospital in Richmond in 1895. And Dr. Walter Foreman and Robert Whitaker founded the Whitaker Memorial Hospital in Newport News in 1908. Particularly instructive, I think, and I want to spend just a few minutes talking about the Burrell Memorial Hospital in Roanoke. Dr. Burrell, let me show you his picture. Dr. Isaac Burrell founded a thriving medical practice in Roanoke in 1893. It ultimately included 8 dentists and doctors, and also had a pharmacy to serve African American customers. Burrell was the founder of the Black Physicians Organization in Roanoke, the Magic City Medical Society. In 1914, he initiated an effort to build a hospital in Roanoke for African Americans. But later that year, he developed acute cholecystitis, which is, as you know, infection of the gallbladder. And it was then, and still is, a surgical emergency. No doctor could be found to operate on him in Roanoke. I don't know why he wasn't brought to Lynchburg Hospital or to one of the hospitals in Richmond, but he was put on a cot in a boxcar and sent to the Freedmen's Hospital at Howard University in Washington. The delay resulted in his death. Roanoke's black community raised the funds and dedicated the new hospital, the next year. This hospital went on to become a major training center for nurses for decades. It was finally accredited in 1935, the first black hospital in Virginia to be accredited. But even by 1945, there were only 23 accredited black hospitals in the country. So, to understand the story of black hospitals and why to understand the story not just of black hospitals, but why Lynchburg needed a black hospital, we have to stop for a minute and talk about the Flexner Report. Now, I want to ask, how many in here have ever heard of the Flexner Report? Okay, one historian and two doctors raised their hands. Thank you. So in 1910, just before the Lynchburg Hospital was built, there was a seismic shift that occurred in American medicine that forever changed the way hospitals were operated and doctors were trained. And it would go on to have a profound effect on black hospitals and the training of black doctors and nurses. The first rumblings of this shift occurred in 1893 with the founding of the Johns Hopkins Medical School. The founding dean of that school, William Henry Welch, had trained in Europe, specifically in Germany, and he recognized the vast superiority of their educational system to what the patchwork system that we had in this country. He hired as his chief physician a Canadian doctor named William Osler. And Osler had also trained abroad. At the time when American medical training was based mostly on rote memorization and had only a loose association with science and virtually no hands-on training, Hopkins represented a radically different approach. Welch and Osler and a few others at Hopkins formed a group that began to push for reform of our medical education system. They ultimately convinced the Carnegie Foundation, which had already identified American medical care as a major concern, to hire this man, Abraham Flexner, to do a top-down study of American medical schools and hospitals. Flexner had no medical experience. He was not a physician. He was not involved in medical education, but he was an educator. And Flexner worked for a number of years, finally publishing his report in 1910. His report identified medical schools and hospitals that were actually beyond redemption and should be closed. His work prompted states to pass licensure requirements for the accreditation of hospitals and doctors. And these requirements ultimately forced many substandard schools out of business. And let me step back just a second, say that a lot of the changes that were mandated by this report, I have a picture of the face page of the report, a lot of the changes that were mandated by this were financed by the Carnegie and Rockefeller foundations. and it took years for these changes to be implemented. But these changes hit the black institutions particularly hard because most of them were under-resourced. Their patients were, for the most part, poor and unable to pay their bills, much less make donations. And before Flexner, there were 7 black medical schools. By 1923, there were only 2. In 1919, there were about 118 segregated and black-controlled hospitals in the country. 75% of them were in the South. So it was apparent to black physicians and the black professional organizations, the National Medical Association, which was the black counterpart to the American Medical Association, the National Hospital Association, which was the counterpart to the American Hospital Association. It was apparent to these organizations that the decline in the number of black medical schools and the difficulty that black hospitals were having in gaining accreditation threatened not only the available of medical care, but the very survival of the black medical profession. You can't train medical students and young doctors without hospitals. So by 1920, this was considered a crisis at a time when Jim Crow was still in its ascendancy and separate but equal was still constitutional. It was apparent that black hospitals were necessary for the survival of the black medical profession. So a group of elite physicians from these organizations that I just mentioned launched a movement to improve black hospitals and to increase the number of accredited hospitals. This movement became known as the Black Hospital Renaissance, and it drew financial support from the General Education Fund, the Duke Endowment, and the Rosenwald Fund. As a result, some hospitals were improved, a few were accredited, but by and large, the Renaissance never materialized. And there are several reasons for that. One was ineffective leadership. These professional organizations were unable to promulgate the guidelines and lend the professional support that this movement needed. The Depression was a really big factor because the organizations that had promised to support this, no longer had the funds to do so. And the third factor, which is often overlooked, is that there was disagreement within the African American community about how to approach this whole issue. Some considered Jim Crow to be immutable. To them, the only open path to improving health care for black people was to make the system less unequal by improving black health care system by getting more and better hospitals and more and better trained doctors. A Negro hospital renaissance was a realistic response to that reality. And you could call this group of people accommodationist. They wanted to accommodate to the system that they were living in. Others favored nothing less than full integration and the abolition of America's caste system. These were integrationists. They favored integration of the races in all parts of society, but especially in medical care. In Lynchburg, the need for more hospital beds to accommodate black patients was evident by the late 1920s. There were at that time about 10,000 black residents in the city and a single segregated black ward at Lynchburg Hospital. Although City Council had discussed solutions for several years, no concrete steps had been taken. So a group of black physicians and ministers, headed by Dr. Kyle M. Pettis, founded the Community Hospital Association in 1929 and made plans to renovate a building at the corner of Floyd and 15th Street. I went looking for more information about that building, and I can tell you it's not there now. They estimated that $10,000 would finance the renovations and provide about 30 beds and offices. So it must have been a fairly substantial building. More would be needed to equip the building. The association planned to raise the funds from organizations and individuals, but the effort obviously failed because I found nothing else in the newspaper after that initial story. And so that was in 1930. Nothing happened for the next 5 years. And then in December 1935, I'm sorry, this was the article in the Lynchburg News in January 1935 about this effort to renovate the building on Floyd Street. And I'm wrong. The date for this was January 1, 1930, not 1935. So in 1935, 5 years later, the Reverend Amos H. Carnegie, no relation to Andrew, arrived in Lynchburg to announce his plan to build a 50-bed Negro hospital here. The hospital he proposed was to be the first in a much grander plan to build a hospital for black people in every American city with 10,000 or more black citizens. By his calculation, that would be 90 hospitals. And that would include 7 in Virginia. To that end, he had founded the National Negro Hospital Fund. He had calculated that if every black person in America donated a penny a week for 20 years, sufficient funds would be available to build and equip these hospitals. And I multiplied that out, and he would have had $125 million. So, who was Amos Carnegie? Despite his high public profile in the 1930s and 40s, we know relatively little about him. What we do know comes from his idiosyncratic and self-laudatory autobiography, which was labeled Part 1, Part 2 never materialized, and contemporaneous newspaper articles. And here I have to stop and say that modern information technology, the internet generally, and in particular newspapers.com, allows us to learn a lot more about Amos Carnegie than people at that time knew. I'm going to share with you what I've learned doing research using newspapers.com. You know that Carnegie was born in 1886, one of 9 children of farming parents in Jamaica. In his teens, he left the farm to train as a policeman, and he joined a church. He was discharged from the police force 3 years later due to poor eyesight, at a time when his involvement with the church was increasing. A formative event in his life at this time was helping to organize and raise funds to build a YMCA in Port Antonio. He left Jamaica for Toronto in 1915 to pursue an education. His peripatetic 8-year journey to a divinity degree took him in and out of school and various menial jobs as he struggled to finance his education. He spent a year at Virginia Union University in Richmond, where in his spare time he proselytized in the city jail and in various low-income neighborhoods. And then he spent a year pastoring a church in Canada, and then another year at Virginia Union. And at one point, during the Great War, he was conscripted into the Canadian Army, but refused to don the uniform and spent 10 months in jail. He finally ended up in the theological department at Lincoln University in southeast Pennsylvania. After graduating, he went to work for the American Sunday School Union. He was stationed in Denmark, South Carolina, where he was to organize Sunday schools. And he organized 4 in destitute communities. And calling upon his YMCA experience in Jamaica, he raised support and funds to build a dedicated Sunday school building. He was apparently good at what he did because he repeated this experience in several other communities, soliciting support from blacks and whites in the form of donated land and building materials, labor, and so forth. And he built a number of small churches. But his Sunday schools faltered. He wrote in his autobiography, quote, "Because of the dense ignorance among the colored people, very few of my Sunday schools lived," end quote. The root problem, he decided, was poor education. He looked at the schools that were available to black children in those communities, and they were indeed what he called rude huts, without windows, without desks. We would probably not even recognize them as schools today. So he spoke to superintendents in multiple counties and learned about available local and state funds and Rosenwald funds to build schools. He developed a vision of a chain of new schools throughout the state, and he solicited the help of wealthy whites by explaining to them that poor education was one of the major reasons why black people were moving to the north, diminishing the labor pool. He explained to the Sunday School Union that he worked for that he planned to build more schools to ensure the success of his Sunday schools. The union responded that it was a religious organization and it wouldn't support his building schools, but he went ahead anyway. And he successfully raised the support and workers to build a school. He was so proud of it that he sent a photo to the secretary of the Sunday School Union and was promptly fired. He undertook, and he stayed in South Carolina, undertook an ambitious organizing effort to build schools across multiple counties. He expanded on practices he had used before, such as enlisting the support of prominent whites, soliciting small donations from the black community, to allay fears of malfeasance. He often made a point of depositing all funds raised with a white trustee, usually a banker. He utilized funds set aside for the purpose by the state and secured grants from the Rosenwald Fund. He often secured the land as a donation. He began making trips to the north, preaching in churches to raise funds for this effort. He established the South Carolina Negro Educational Improvement Association so that on his trips north he could say that he represented that organization. And according to his autobiography, he had organized 20 efforts in 5 counties when he was told by the state authorities to halt all activities to build schools. He was told he could build one school in the community in which he lived, but not others. We can only speculate about the reasons for this restriction. Part of it may have been that the state just didn't have the funds. But at any rate, he packed up his wife and child and left the state. He lived for a short while in New York with his sister. Then he gained appointment to a church in Chattanooga, and then a church in Marion, Virginia. See, everybody know where Marion is? It's sort of west of Roanoke. So anyway, in Marion, as he had in South Carolina, he found deplorable educational conditions. and he obtained approval of the town council and agreements from free labor from black brick masons and carpenters and other support. And he made a trip to the north to raise funds, and he built a brick high school. He claimed it was the only one between Roanoke and Bristol, and it was named in his honor. This highway marker was put up in Marion 3 years ago. One of the things to note in the last paragraph of this marker, I know you're not speed readers, everybody, but it notes that Katherine Johnson, the NASA mathematician on whose story the movie Hidden Figures was based, taught here for several years. How long Carnegie remained in Marion is unclear, but we know from an article in an April 1934 newspaper that he had founded the National Negro Hospital Fund, and he had planned to raise $150 million to build standard Negro hospitals throughout the country. By February 1935, Carnegie's plan included building a hospital in 90 U.S. cities, funded by the penny a month, a penny a week plan that I mentioned earlier. Pennies were to be deposited in collection boxes in 42,600 black churches. Each church member would be pledged to bring in one other member, and a committee in each church would be responsible for opening the box and transferring the funds to the treasurer in New York. All very elaborate. So, as I said, Carnegie first appeared in Lynchburg in 1935. Why Lynchburg? Well, we know that he was already active in Boston, and that he had almost certainly met Dr. Henry A. Christian, a Lynchburg native, about whom I will say more in just a minute. By the time he got to Lynchburg, the broad outlines of his modus operandi were obviously were already in place. He had a passion for social justice. He had already demonstrated a penchant for organizing. He relied on what he called a biracial approach. He had a reliance on large charities like the Rosenwald Fund. He had demonstrated that he could go north and raise money, and he always wanted to elicit the cooperation of white people. He favored fiduciary transparency and went to great lengths to make that happen. And he courted the wealthy and the powerful. The themes of extensive travel is something else that comes up in his writing and his speaking during this time. He kept claiming that he had traveled this country 42,000 miles, and that he had, over 15 months, surveying black hospitals and black medical education. So I think that just gave him an air of authority, like he knew what he was talking about. Nobody, as far as I know, ever verified these particular facts. When he first appeared in Lynchburg, he was living on Pierce Street, 2 doors down from Edward and Ann Spencer. He probably rented a room there. And so he was very likely acquainted with them. He enlisted the help of the Reverend William Elliott, pastor of Court Street Baptist, to organize a group of ministers and another of physicians with whom he could meet. And then a few days later, had a mass meeting at the church. From these meetings, he would organize a committee to direct the fundraising effort. He told those gathered that a campaign had been launched in New York City on November 4th, and that a nationwide campaign would be launched soon. And then, crickets. There was no mention of him or this hospital effort in the Lynchburg papers until September 1937. That's a hiatus of almost 2 years. So where had Carnegie been during these 22 months? And this is where newspapers.com comes in. It helps us a little bit figure this thing out. I found no record of his activities in 1936. In early 1937, he applied for a charter of incorporation for his National Negro Hospital Foundation in Massachusetts. The charter was denied. According to this article, the Massachusetts Public Welfare Commissioner at the time said that incorporation, quote, has consistently been opposed by the majority of colored residents of the Commonwealth, end quote. Later that year, the foundation was incorporated in Delaware, and by November 1937, he had obtained a certificate of authority to operate in Virginia. We know that in June 1937, he opened the national headquarters of his foundation in Boston. The foundation's national president and all 5 members of its board were white men. One of those men was Lynchburg native Dr. Henry A. Christian. Some of you, how many people in here know about Dr. Henry Christian? Let me see. So, I think I've lost my place. Oh, Dr. Christian was a Lynchburg native and half first cousin of Asbury Christian, the Methodist minister who wrote Lynchburg and Its People. He was a graduate of Randolph-Macon College, and in 1900, a graduate of the Johns Hopkins Medical School, where he undoubtedly would have been a student of the aforementioned William Osler. At the tender age of 31, he became dean of the Harvard Medical School, and was known thereafter as the boy dean. He was a professor of medicine in the school from 1908 until his retirement in 1939. In 1913, he was named physician-in-chief at the newly opened Peter Ben Brigham Hospital, a position he occupied also until his retirement. Among his many accomplishments, Dr. Christian was, for many years, the editor of Sir William Osler's famous textbook, The Principles and Practice of Medicine, which remained in print for 105 years. In 1947, Dr. Christian was awarded the American Medical Association's Distinguished Service Medal, which was appropriately recognized in an editorial in the Lynchburg News. By the time Carnegie reappeared in Lynchburg in September 1937, his plan had been further elaborated. The undertaking was now described as interracial. Support would be sought from blacks and whites, and the committee to oversee the construction of the hospital would consist of 2 whites and 3 blacks, plus the executive secretary, Mr. Carnegie. The hospital would be named the Dr. Henry A. Christian Hospital. The National Negro Hospital Fund had become the National Negro Hospital Foundation, Incorporated, with headquarters in Boston. As he had in 1935, Carnegie told his audiences that the project would be funded by a combination of locally donated funds and funds donated to the national campaign. Lynchburg's Negro Hospital was to be the first of 90 and a model for other cities. He told the Boston Globe that the black people of Lynchburg had already bought a site for the hospital, which is something I could not verify anywhere. In December of that year, it was announced that the campaign had been postponed to January because of the holidays. So by November 1937, Carnegie had an office at 807 8th Street. His letterhead listed both national and local officers, the foundation trustees, and the local committee members, as well as, curiously to us, but probably not to them, a list of white endorsers. Before I leave this slide, there's just so much we could unpack on this slide, and I shouldn't take the time. But I do want to mention just a minute about the white endorsers. This is lifted from the letterhead. They included Senator Carter Glass at the top of the list on the left, who most of you know was a pretty well-known segregationist. And I'm sure that this list contains others who would favor a separation of the races, but I have not researched their personal or political or racial attitudes. But there are people in this list that many of you will recognize. I see, just briefly, leaders of business, like Max Guggenheimer, physicians, Dr. Elisha Barksdale was in this list, as was Dr. Eugene Grosclose, Dr. Coons, other people that many of you would know. Let's see. So, the campaign began as promised in mid-January 1938 with the opening of a headquarters at 724 Main Street. That's the block now occupied by Pacific Life. Its goal was $50,000, and the campaign planning group included a number of prominent women in the community, as well as white physicians, Don Preston Peters and Clarence Kiefer, and black physicians, Walter Johnson and William H. Roberts, and the Reverend Elliott from Court Street Baptist Church. The main event of this campaign took place 2 weeks later. About 600 people, 500 of whom were black, crowded into the city armory to hear Judge Don Halsey, Rabbi Isadora Franzblau, Mrs. Stanhope Johnson, the Reverend Carnegie, and Reverend Elliott speak. Rabbi Franzblau told the crowd that Lynchburg could not maintain its fine condition if 1/4 of its population, quote, can't be given proper hospitalization, end quote. Carnegie told the crowd that his movement had the endorsement of 36 governors and medical associations. Reverend Elliott appealed to black people to, quote, better our race, end quote, and told them that the Negro Ministers Alliance of Lynchburg endorsed the project. The meeting ended with a rousing concert by the Hampton Male Quartet, after which an offering was collected. The Armory event appeared to be a resounding success, but the campaign, alas, was not. This article appeared in the news a year later, in March 1939, and it reported that local businesses were returning to their employees the funds that they had collected. The treasurer of the campaign, Mr. A.M. White, told the newspaper that the campaign was inactive and that donated funds would be returned. There were a number of likely reasons for the campaign's failure, some of which were the same as those responsible for the failure of the Black Hospital Renaissance, mainly the Depression. The effects of the Depression were felt most keenly by those who were expected to contribute the most. And there was disagreement within the African American community as to the most effective response to the reality of Jim Crow. Not all blacks were accommodationists willing to build a system parallel to the one from which they were excluded. A growing number saw integration as the proper response and refused to support efforts that would help sustain Jim Crow. Some black citizens criticized Reverend Elliott for his support of the hospital campaign. The national campaign did not have the support of the National Medical Association, which in an editorial in its journal called it a fantasy and said that, quote, "No power on earth or in heaven or under the earth has yet succeeded in cementing even 1,000 Negroes on any one project, regardless of its merits," end quote. Some black people simply did not see a separate hospital for blacks as a practical solution to the healthcare access. Whit N. Brown. Has anybody here heard of Whit Brown? Well, he was a New York native. He speculated in Lynchburg real estate, and he was known locally as the King of Fifth Street. And Whit said, quote, "Lynchburg Hospital belongs to the whole city, us as much as anybody, and we don't want to improve and pay for what we get over there." When Brown died in 1946, he left his entire estate to Lynchburg General Hospital. Another reason might have been Carnegie's absence. There is no record of his presence in Lynchburg after the Armory event in February of 1938, but there is ample evidence of his presence elsewhere. In May 1938, he was in Wilmington, Delaware, organizing a similar effort. He told the Morning News in Wilmington that Lynchburg had thus far raised $16,000. In a new twist, his funding scheme also included government money. He was seeking 45% of the cost for the hospital from the Public Works Administration and had secured endorsements from both of Delaware's United States senators. Later, the prospect of partial government funding would become an integral part of his financing schemes. In August and September 1938, he was in Hampton to raise interest in building a black hospital there. In November and December 1938, he was in Pittsburgh, organizing an effort to build a $1 million, 150-bed hospital. As he had in Lynchburg and Wilmington, he recruited the support of an interracial group of prominent religious leaders, physicians, bankers, and businessmen. The 100-member committee, anybody ever tried to organize a 100-member committee? In Pittsburgh, had a white chairman and a black vice chairman. And undeterred by his failure to mount a successful campaign in Lynchburg, he continued to work on his projects in Wilmington, Hampton, and Pittsburgh, and began organizing in Louisville, Kentucky. But a major shift in his plans occurred in early 1940 when President Roosevelt announced a plan to be overseen by the Federal Works Agency to build up to 50 hospitals in areas of need. The initial proposal to put $10 million into this project grew to $60 million in the Senate version of the bill that passed in mid-1940. It undoubtedly occurred to Carnegie that the penny a month plan had not been successful, but that this federal legislation, if passed, might yet offer at least a partial realization of his ambitious dreams. He arranged for on-air interviews with prominent U.S. senators, including James J. Davis of Pennsylvania, a supporter of the legislation, Harry F. Byrd of Virginia, and H. Styles Bridges of New Hampshire. These were carried over the radio networks and were heard all over the country. At his urging, the National Negro Hospital Foundation asked the federal government, as part of the proposed $60 million hospital program, to build 6 hospitals for blacks in the South, all in metropolitan areas. Unlike the earlier national campaign to support the proposed Henry A. Christian Hospital, This one did have the support of the National Medical Association, as well as the NAACP, the National Dental Association, and other prominent black professional organizations. But Roosevelt's plan was opposed by much of organized medicine, including Lynchburg Academy of Medicine, and ultimately died in the House of Representatives. This seems to have taken some of the wind out of Carnegie's sails, because no more hospital building plans were reported in the 1940s. Carnegie did, however, found the National Negro Farm Owners Association in 1944 with a financing scheme to help sharecroppers become independent farmers. He re-emerged with more hospital financing schemes, though, in the 1950s. In August 1951, the New York Times reported that he had announced plans for a $4 million, 200-bed interracial hospital in Washington, D.C. A year later, in October '52, he reappeared in Lynchburg. He met with black and white leaders, hoping to revive the campaign that had died 14 years before. And he told them that the National Hospital Foundation, he dropped the word Negro, still wanted to build hospitals in every U.S. city with more than 10,000 black residents. He emphasized that the hospital would not be just for blacks, that the staff would be open to all qualified professionals. As with dropping Negro from the name, these changes indicated that he had adjusted his message to counter the objections raised earlier by integrationists. But nothing came of this effort. The Washington Hospital never materialized, and the Lynchburg newspapers reported no further efforts beyond this initial exploratory meeting. After his 1952 appearance in Lynchburg, Carnegie ceases to be part of our hospital story. But his efforts to build hospitals continued, and he concocted other grand schemes to help African Americans. Later that year, he announced plans to build 7 hospitals for African Americans in Florida. In February 1953, he was in Birmingham to resume a campaign begun 10 years earlier. Later that year, he was fined and given suspended jail time for soliciting in Alabama without a permit. He then applied for a permit in Birmingham, but was denied. Local black citizens expressed doubts about his plan. In December 1953, he announced cancellation of the plans for the Birmingham Hospital and said he would return all donated funds. In 1954, he announced a nationwide campaign to build a $4 million hospital in Brooklyn. In 1956, he proposed a 500-bed interracial hospital in Chicago. In 1964, he launched the self-help movement, American Biracial Association Incorporated, to collect $1 each month for 10 years from all black wage earners through a payroll deduction plan. The money was to be used to fund a cleanup of slum areas across the country. Even as the Civil Rights Law and Medicare were making integration of the races a reality, Carnegie, through his National Interchurch Hospital Association, was proposing a chain of hospitals across the country, including a 200-bed facility in San Antonio. In 1968, 3 years after Medicare and after integration of hospitals, he announced a plan to build a $15 million, 500-bed hospital in Brooklyn, which would be the first of 12 hospitals to be built over 10 years. Carnegie would have been 82 at this time. And when that may have been his last big effort. He died 10 years later at the age of 92 in Flushing, Queens. I will just mention that he was married to Susan Euphemia Blake. They had 5 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. The youngest was Amos Jr., who died in 2014. So this story is largely about the effort to build the Lynchburg Hospital, but it's really a much bigger, it's part of a much bigger story about this unusual man. What are we to make of Amos H. Carnegie? A few years ago, Rick Peaster, some of you know Rick, he used to be the chief executive officer of the Lynchburg Symphony. He is a historian. He wrote a really wonderful history of Lynchburg medicine. And it includes a few paragraphs about Amos H. Carnegie. And Rick pointed out that Carnegie had promised to build hospitals in multiple localities, but had never delivered. And he concluded that he was a charlatan. And, you know, Rick might be right, but a fuller examination of the history leaves room for doubt. It's clear that religious zeal drove Carnegie's actions, from his early success at funding a YMCA in Jamaica to his circuitous route to a divinity degree, to his successful building of churches and schools in South Carolina and Virginia, and finally to these grand schemes to address racial inequalities in healthcare. But neither religious zeal nor passion for social justice fully explains the reach that he achieved. And I think there were two other characteristics that helped to explain that. One is his ability to convince others. He must have been, you know, a very dynamic and utterly convincing speaker. The other was a powerful work ethic. He was active in multiple cities simultaneously, talking with community leaders, organizing committees, speaking to potential donors, and courting donors and media. His autobiography and a brief, poorly documented Wikipedia article suggest that his total dedication to the cause often meant that he neglected his family and a failure to provide for their basic needs. I found no evidence that Carnegie swindled anyone. He took elaborate steps to assure fiduciary integrity, and there was no evidence that he ever became wealthy or even financially comfortable. That he spent 35 years concocting grand schemes and working to implement them is evident. That he never succeeded is also clear. Was he a misguided dreamer who was able to convince others to follow? Were his aims more nefarious? Was he driven purely by religious zeal or self-promotion? The mystery novelist Rita Mae Brown is the one who first said insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So maybe he was a little nutty. At this point, it's fair to say that the records available to us do not allow for a clear answer to the Carnegie riddle. And I'm going to leave it there and entertain the questions if there are any. I've taken you a full hour. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Before you all go, I'd like to introduce the Vice President of the Board of Trustees for the Jones Memorial Library. He has a brief announcement. Go ahead.
My name is Jerry Shareko, and I just want to say this ends our series 2021-2022. Thank you, Dr. Wright. We are working on our 2022-2023 series, which will start again in September. We don't have all of the speakers set yet, but I can tell you the 4 of the 6 that we have. Kim Payne, our former city manager, is going to give a talk on Confederate monuments. Nancy Wheeland, who of course works here at the Jones, is going to do an updated talk on bawdy ladies, a talk that she's done in the past. John Abel, professor of economics over at Randolph College, is going to talk about the history of redlining in Lynchburg. And John Donchamont, recently retired from Randolph College's history department, is going to talk about some aspect of slavery in Virginia. We have 2 others we're working on. They will start again in September. See you then. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you all so much for coming.
But somebody was in the field going, hey! And maybe, just maybe, somebody all the way across the field called back, hey! And then maybe, just maybe, because this is a blues, somebody got sad and said, go ahead and marry, don't you? Wait on me, because they were building that railroad that took everything across this great country. Go ahead and marry, don't you? Wait